konnichiwa, good afternoon, et bonjour. Dear State Minister Yamada, dear Director General Vitorino, dear Mr. Kimisuka, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to present you some of our work on social integration in OECD countries and in international comparison. But let me briefly give you a quick overview of how that fits in our broader work at the OECD on international migration. We monitor migration trends and policies mainly through our International Migration Outlook, which is our flagship publication. We assess the impact of migration on host country societies and labor markets and economies at large. We assess migration policies, notably also regarding labor migration, and we actually have an ongoing review of Japan right now. We respond to emerging challenges and help our member countries to identify appropriate responses, for example, climate change and migration, and regarding the refugee crisis. And last but not least, to tackle the challenges of integration of immigrants and their children. And among that, we do a lot of statistical work, but we also do a lot of policy work. And we are now publishing a new overview of integration measures for new arrivals, among which I will give you a little sneak preview regarding social integration. Everybody agrees that this is important, but what it actually means is quite difficult to grasp for many people. What is behind it? Social cohesion, common values, or blending in perhaps in the Japanese context, or in other countries, the sense of belonging to. All these factors are frequently referred to, but nothing really fully captures it. It's clearly a two-way process that involves both migrants and the host country community. At the national level, there are integration courses, and there's increasingly a focus on social integration in those courses. But at best, such courses transmit awareness of values and belonging, but they cannot actually achieve it. That is obviously something that has to be achieved at the local level. That's where actual social integration takes place. And interestingly, in surveys, migrants often report a greater sense of belonging to the local community than to the host country at large. When we look at social integration systems in the OECD, one of the first striking things that one sees is that some countries talk about social integration and others about civic integration. And that makes quite a bit of a difference. Social integration strengthens more this belonging, togetherness, blending in aspects, and civic integration is more about adherence to the same values and norms. Social orientation is something that's really specific for new arrivals. Whatever is the exact connotation, it is always an increasingly important element of integration policies. And the social integration focus has often been introduced and strengthened in a reaction to past perceived integration failures, notably in Europe. So what are some of the intentions and characteristics of those systems? They are to transmit host country specific knowledge regarding the political system, the society, and the history, but also norms and values. It has very strong links with language training, and actually, as we'll see in a minute, quite often social integration courses are embedded in language training. In the settlement countries, the focus is on welcoming societies, engaging in the host community. In Europe, the focus is increasingly on obligatory participation in some civic integration tracks, with various sanctions for people who do not participate or who do not manage to pass an exam where exams exist. And these sanctions can be a less stable permit, cuts in benefits, or administrative fines, but actually enforcement is difficult and rarely done. When we look at what people actually understand when they talk about social integration, we can look for the European countries at the Eurobarometer from 2021, which actually asks the question, what do you think, what means social integration? And most people see it as speaking the official language. The second most important is to accept the values and norms of the host country societies. The third is having friends from the host country. And the fourth is to share host country cultural traditions. But as you can see, on average, a majority of respondents believe that all 4 areas are actually very important. More generally, new arrivals do not only need language and job support, but also need to understand how the host country society functions and what are the expectations of the host country vis-a-vis its residents. And that obviously will differ greatly across host countries. With that in mind, it is clear that social integration is becoming an increasing element of integration measures in OECD countries. And here we have mapped the number of hours of social orientation that are given to new arrivals. And you can see, actually, when one looks in absolute levels, Japan is number 2 in terms of hours that civic or social orientation is given. Most countries have somewhat around 40 to 60 hours. That's what the average is. We have also a number of countries, the settlement countries, the United States, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, where actually there's no standard civic integration program, but there's a lot of measures, notably at the local level, to transmit these norms and to help immigrants to blend in and to be part of the local society. The design of social integration courses is also done in many different ways. One of the first fundamental differentiations is what is the language of instruction in which social integration is taught. Is it in the country, in the language of the host country, or is it in the language in which the migrants speak at home, so in their origin country language? Most countries have chosen the latter option, so that migrants are being taught in a language in which they were born, raised, and educated, because it's deemed that it's necessary, that it's fully understood what is being taught there. But some countries have also chosen the host country language, notably some of the Southern European countries. In some countries, it's embedded as part of the language courses, but in the most cases, as also in Japan, it's a separate element. And last but not least, in a significant number of countries, as you can see here, participation is obligatory for those, notably often for humanitarian migrants. It's generally not obligatory for labor migrants, for whom it's, however, increasingly offered as something where they may participate if they're interested to, but they're not obliged to do so. Another trend is that civic integration, social orientation, social integration, however you call it, is increasingly moved out of the classroom. Networks are particularly important here for the outcomes. And obviously networks is not something that you're going to make in a classroom. Like same thing, like social integration, norms, values, blending in, that's not something that you can learn in a classroom. So countries have increasingly taken innovative ways of promoting such social integration. Some of the innovations you can see here on this slide, Canada Settlement Program, for example, includes increasingly conversation circles, museum visits, or community events where the migrants are being taken along so that they actively participate in that. In Belgium, new arrivals in Flanders, Belgium, new arrivals get a buddy who basically mentors them and shows them around in the local community, but also is supposed to transmit him or her the values of the host society. In other countries, libraries are an increasingly important entry because that you can read and that you can converse in the rooms. And the Welcoming Communities program, as already mentioned, to bring members of the local community together with migrants. And this is something which is very strong in the settlement countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. The third trend is that social integration increasingly starts before departure. Pre-arrival courses are becoming increasingly common. Some countries have relatively comprehensive introduction measures. These are the ones shown here. Others have mainly pre-departure orientation sessions or materials which are often available online, but rarely are done through in-person classes. But you can see there's a broad mix between in-person classes, online options, more comprehensive measures, and more simple information sessions. But clearly, it's a trend that we see that more is done prior to arrival, that people are already informed about the social fabric in their host countries before they arrive. And there's a broad range of stakeholders achieved. That's perhaps the single most striking trend, that we see more and more stakeholders involved in social integration. Local governments, national governments, migrants themselves, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, employers themselves are becoming increasingly engaged to make sure that their new workers are also integrated socially in their families. And last but not least, the civil society through many different means. That obviously also raises coordination challenges, and it's important that these different stakeholders all share the underlying objective of making sure that social integration succeeds. In a nutshell, social integration is something that is clearly receiving increasing attention across the OECD. There's a broad agreement regarding its importance, but what it actually means is very difficult to gauge, and let alone to measure social integration. Obviously, when you already have difficulties of defining it and to measure it, it's also not so clear what that really means for reception and integration policies. But one thing that's sure, it's something that is not physically tangible, and it's not something that you can learn in a classroom setting. It's something that is a tacit process that takes time over time. And as a result, as you have seen, there's a striking amount of new approaches and new stakeholders that have emerged. I thank you very much for your attention and wish you much success in this very interesting event today. And thank you very much to the Japanese authorities for giving me the opportunity to present some of the work that you can find in these forthcoming publications. I look forward to engaging with you further. Unfortunately, it cannot be physically today, but feel free to contact me with my contact details here, and I look forward to hearing more from your discussions today. Thank you.